that they speak similar languages and they share ethnic traits. Stereotypes of Jews, stereotypes of Arabs tend to look very similar. Both Jews and Arabs look back to golden ages of power and prosperity and cultural achievement that have been marred by centuries of outside domination. And that historical self-knowledge, that idea of a golden past that has been ruined by outsiders coming in, historically grounded idea, right? This is not fantasy. That's the context in which both some Jews and some Arabs develop a sense of nationalism that will determine them as Israelis and Palestinians over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. My argument is that Israeli and Palestinian nationalisms, not only are they both invented, like every other, but they're invented at essentially the same time and in response to one another. Both groups will develop a sense of national identity in strangled and unfortunate circumstances, developing historical self-love at a historical period that did not encourage it in either Arab or Jew. Zionism. Let's start there. Let's start with the idea of Israeli nationalism. Zionism is simply the belief that Jews constitute a nation, and that this nation deserves the liberties and prerogatives of other such groups, including the right to return to their ancestral homeland. Now, today this means the establishment and now support of a state for Jews in what is Israel. But that's meant lots of different things over the course of the centuries. It's worth pointing out that not every Jew is a Zionist, nor through history has every Jew been a Zionist. Some Jews in America and in other places identify themselves solely as citizens of the countries in which they live. Some others reject totally the idea of nationalism. Nationalism as being something that has historically been bad for Jews. Some others think of themselves as Jews only in a religious or a cultural sense, not as a member of a Jewish nation in any political way. Not all Jews are Zionists. Not every Zionist is a Jew. Some Christians take the establishment of a state of Israel as a biblically foreseen and required precursor to a second coming. And indeed, many Gentiles today support the existence of a state of Israel, perhaps out of admiration of Jews or of the state of Israel, perhaps out of recognition of the historical plight of Jews, most dramatically the Holocaust. And indeed, taken to the extreme, we can point out that even some anti-Semites have been Zionists, since it meant getting the Jews out of the country. Adolf Eichmann in Germany was a liaison with German Jewish Zionist offices. He went to Palestine. He learned some Hebrew. Clearly, this is a forced, perverse Zionism, but it still holds the basic principle that Jews constitute a distinct nation and ought to be in a state that marries to that nation. Oh, the flip side of this is to argue what I want to argue to you now, just very briefly, that to be an anti-Zionist is not necessarily to be an anti-Semite. Some people who have no problem with Jews as Jews support the Arab position out of sincere conviction. Other people who are deeply concerned with Jewish history, sympathetic toward the Jewish position in the world and in history, simply believe that Zionism was a bad idea and has done the Jews and others harm. This is not a blank assertion that to be an anti-Zionist is not necessarily to be an anti-Semite. It is standard fodder, indeed, among some elements, not only of Israeli, but of American political life, to habitually equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. That's no good. But we need to recognize that that didn't come out of a historical vacuum. That Jews may hear criticism of Israel through a different historical filter than other people do. And we have to recognize that sometimes criticism of Israel is explicitly anti-Semitic. It is undeniable. Criticism of Israel today overlaps with, and in many cases reinforces, traditional anti-Semitism in the Arab world and in some of Europe too. The mainstream Arab press speaks in a shockingly anti-Semitic language much of the time. And old-style Jew-hating in Europe has gotten a boost from criticism of Israel. But I want to get back to history. What is Zionism? Zionism is a nationalist movement occurring in Europe at a particular historical moment. Over the course of the 19th century, I would put it in the context of and argue that it is essentially similar to other nationalist movements that developed around the world, especially in Europe, in this period of time. Now, at some level, this is counterintuitive for Americans to even think of Jews as a nation, because we think of Jewishness as a religion, and we don't talk about Catholics or Protestants or Lutherans as nations. Nevertheless, Jewishness is also an ethnicity. It is also a cultural identity. And a belief prevails among many Jews, even in America, that Jews do constitute a people, a nation. Indeed, even if some Jews have been converted or don't practice Judaism, they will still attach to this kind of identity. And this idea is rooted in the Bible. This idea, I'm arguing that Jewish nationalism, that Zionism, is a 19th and 20th century phenomenon, but its roots are scriptural. They are historical. The Hebrews were a people, united politically by their covenant with God. Identity and religion intertwined for the Jews from the beginning. And identification with that land has not grown weaker in the absence of that land in diaspora. Indeed, it may be the single most important core element in this historical miracle of the survival of the Jews for these thousands of years. Because for now 2 millennia, most Jews have not been Judeans, nor did Jews possess Jerusalem, nor did most of them speak Hebrew, though most of them could read it. Were Jews a nation when they had no common language in most of the world and no common land in which they all lived and no state? I mean, clearly they had some of the elements of a nation, but lacked some of these other important ones. All of this begins to change in the late 18th century with the Enlightenment in Europe. An Enlightenment that argued for civic equality in a secular state. More and more European Jews were emerged to come out of the ghetto, literally and metaphorically. Jews were increasingly encouraged to think of themselves as German or Frenchmen or Englishmen or Americans, and the Jews responded in all of those places. Many Jewish Germans and Americans and Frenchmen began to reject the notion of a return to Jerusalem. Indeed, they began to believe that a modernizing and reforming Europe could be Zion, could be the end of diaspora. And so a Jewish enlightenment would rise up in response to all of this, encouraging Jews to assimilate. And indeed, had the Enlightenment been stronger, wider spread, had it run deeper in European society, we might never have had a Zionism. But the majority of Jews didn't live in America, nor did they live in the enlightened Germany of the 18th and 19th century, nor did they live in Republican France. The majority of Jews lived in Eastern Europe, where the Enlightenment never went as deep, where the traditions of equality and reason had not made the same inroads. In countries like Poland and Romania and Russia, Jews were still subject to all of the old privations and violence. This is not conducive to buying into these new ideas of assimilation and integration. And so some Eastern European Jews reacted to the ongoing suffering by withdrawing into a heightened version of their own religion, by mysticism, religiosity, Hasidism, ultra-Orthodoxy. These are relatively recent phenomena. Some other will respond by a kind of local Jewish nationalism, emphasizing in places like Poland what life in the diaspora had managed to accomplish, fueling an explosion of culture in Yiddish. But some began to believe that only a return to Israel could solve the problem of Jews in the wider world. This philosophy then is Zionism, a distinctively late 19th century political philosophy that in many ways looks an awful lot like the emerging German nationalism and American nationalism and French nationalism that's coming around at the same time. Jews are redefining themselves as a nation at a time when everyone around them is redefining themselves as a nation, and they are largely doing it in ways that begin to exclude Jews by the end of the 19th century. The old